And let's see. We're now on the section titled The First Day at William France. Once we were inside the building, the marshals walked us up a flight of stairs. The school office was at the top. My mother and I went in and were told to sit in the principal's office. The marshals sat outside. There were windows in the room where we waited. That meant everybody passing by could see us. I remember noticing everyone was white. All day long, white parents rushed into the office. They were upset. They were arguing and pointing at us. When they took their children to school that morning, the parents hadn't been sure whether William France would be integrated that day or not. After my mother and I arrived, they ran into classrooms and dragged their children out of the school. From behind the windows in the office, all I saw was confusion. I told myself that this must be the way it is in a big school. The whole first day, my mother and I just sat and waited. We didn't talk to anybody. I remember watching a big round clock on the wall. When it was 3 o'clock and time to go home, I was glad. I thought my new school would be hard, but the first day was easy. And there are several more quotes at the bottom. A procession of mothers moved in and out of the schools, removing books and other belongings of their children. Many vowed that their children would not return to class so long as Negroes were there. When the Negroes entered the schools, many white pupils walked out. They were encouraged by the state legislature, which passed a resolution calling for the boycott of mixed schools. Going home. When we left school that first day, the crowd outside was even bigger and louder than it had been in the morning. There were reporters and film cameras and people everywhere. I guess the police couldn't keep them behind the barricades. It seemed to take us a long time to get to the marshal's car. Later on, I learned that there had been protesters in front of the 2 integrated schools the whole day. They wanted to be sure white parents would boycott the school and not let their children attend. Groups of high school boys joining the protesters paraded up and down the street and sang new verses to old hymns. Their favorite was the Battle Hymn of the Republic, in which they changed the chorus to "Glory, glory, segregation, the South will rise again." Many of the boys carried signs and said awful things, but most of all I remember seeing a black doll in a coffin, which frightened me more than anything else. After the first day, I was glad to get home. I wanted to change my clothes and go outside to find my friends. My mother wasn't too worried about me because the police had set up barricades at each end of the block. Only local residents were allowed on the street. That afternoon, I taught a friend the chant I had learned, 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate. My friend and I didn't know what the words meant, but we would jump rope to it every day after school. My father heard about the trouble at school. That night when he came home from work, he said I was his brave little Ruby. And then here is a quote from Ruby's first grade teacher. Leaving the school day each day seemed even more frightening than arriving in the morning. I always drove to work and kept my car on the playground behind the school building. The police had turned the playground into a parking lot because it was the only area they could protect. On leaving school in the afternoon, even with a police escort, you were always fearful of how the people gathered along the sidewalks might choose to protest the day you drove past them. The New Orleans police were supposed to be there to help us, but they very much disliked being the ones to enforce integration, so you could never be confident of their support and cooperation. And this is titled My First White Teacher. On the second day, my mother and I drove to school with the marshals. The crowd outside the building was ready. Reese's spat at us and shouted things like, "Go home," N-word, and "No N-words allowed here." One woman screamed at me, "I'm going to poison you, I'll find a way." She made the same threat every morning. I tried not to pay attention. When we finally got into the building, my new teacher was there to meet us. Her name was Mrs. Henry. She was young and white. I had not spent time with a white person before, so I was uneasy at first. Mrs. Henry led us upstairs to the second floor. As we went up, we hardly saw anyone else in the building. The white students were not coming to class. The halls were so quiet I could hear the noise the marshal's shoes made on the shiny hardwood floors. Mrs. Henry took us into a classroom and said to have a seat. When I looked around, the room was empty. There were rows of desks, but no children. I thought we were too early, but Mrs. Henry said we were right on time. My mother sat down at the back of the room. I took a seat up front and Mrs. Henry began to teach. I spent the whole first day with Mrs. Henry in the classroom. I wasn't allowed to have lunch in the cafeteria or go outside for recess, so we just stayed in our room. The marshals sat outside. If I had to go to the bathroom, the marshals walked me down the hall. My mother sat in the classroom that day, but not the next. When the marshals came to the house on Wednesday morning, my mother said, "Ruby, I can't go to school with you today, but don't be afraid. The marshals will take good care of you. Be good now and don't cry." I started to cry anyway, but before I knew it, I was off to school by myself. And here's another quote from her teacher. There was a certain shyness about Ruby. She would appear at the door of our room in the morning and walk in slowly, taking little steps. I would always greet her with a compliment about how nicely she was dressed to help make her feel special, as she was, and to make her feel more welcome and comfortable. We would hug, and then we would sit down side by side. We had our corner of the room, and it was cozy. I never sat in the front of the classroom apart from her. If I went to the blackboard, she was always right there with me. I grew to love Ruby and to be awed by her. It was an ugly world outside, but I tried to make our world together as normal as possible. Neither of us ever missed a day. It was important to keep going. What a Passerby Wrote. The author John Steinbeck was driving through New Orleans with his dog, Charlie, when he heard about the racist crowds that gathered outside the France school each morning to protest its integration. He decided to go see what was happening. He especially wanted to see a group of women who came to scream at me and the white children who crossed the picket lines and went to school. At the time, I didn't know that there were other children in the building because we were kept apart. The women were known as the cheerleaders, and their foul language even shocked a man as worldly as Steinbeck. I never met John Steinbeck, but he seemed to sympathize with what I was going through. He wrote about me in a book called Travels with Charlie. Steinbeck left his dog and his truck in a parking lot. He didn't want to take them to France where his dog could get hurt or his car could get damaged. Instead, he took a cab. Fearing that protesters would wreck his car, the driver didn't take Steinbeck all the way to the school, but left him a few blocks away. Steinbeck never knew my name. My name and the names of the girls at McDonough School were never mentioned on television or in the newspapers. The press tried to protect us. And here is a quote from John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. The show opened on time. Sounds of sirens, motorcycle cops, the two big black cars filled with big men in blonde felt hats pulled up at the front of the school. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. 4 big marshals got out of each car, and from somewhere in the automobiles they extracted the littlest Negro girl you ever saw, dressed in shiny, starchy white, with new white shoes on, feet so little they were almost round. Her face and little legs were very black against the white. The big marshals stood her on the curb, and a jangle of jeering shrieks went up from behind the barricades. The little girl did not look at the howling crowd, but from the sides of whites of her eyes showed like those of a frightened fawn. The men turned her around like a doll, and then the strange procession moved up the broad walk toward the school. And the child was even more a mite because the men were so big. Then the girl made a curious hop, and I think I know what it was. I think in her whole life she had not gone 10 steps without skipping, but now in the middle of the first step the weight bore her down, and her little round feet took measured, reluctant steps between the tall guards. Slowly they climbed the steps and entered the school. Some show courage. At the start of the school integration, many white parents were afraid of the protesters in front of the France school. Even if the parents believed in integration, they didn't want to put their children in danger by sending them to class. However, a few families took the risk. As a Methodist minister, Reverend Lloyd Foreman was convinced that integration was morally and spiritually right and was determined to keep his daughter Pam in the France school. That November, the minister walked Pam to and from school every day. Very quickly, the chorus of racists became obsessed with the Foremans. They taunted them without mercy. And here's another quote from Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. The crowd was waiting for the white man who dared to bring his white child to school. And here he came along the guarded walk, a tall man dressed in light gray, leading his frightened child by the hand. His body was tensed as a strong leaf spring drawn to the breaking strain. His face was grave and gray, and his eyes were on the ground immediately ahead of him. The muscles of his cheeks stood out from clenched jaws, a man afraid who by his will held his fears in check as a great rider directs a panicked horse. A shrill, grating voice rang out. The yelling was not in chorus. Each took a turn, and at the end of each, the crowd broke into howls and roars and whistles of applause. This is what they had come to see and hear. No newspapers had printed the words these women shouted. It was indicated that they were indelicate, some even said obscene. On television, the soundtrack was made to blur or had crowd noises cut into cover. But now I heard the words bestial and filthy and degenerate. Another first grader. The Gabrielles were another brave family. Daisy and her husband Jim had several children, including a 6-year-old named Yolanda. Mrs. Gabrielle had been in the army during World War II, and she refused to be bullied by the protesters. When I entered William France, Daisy Gabrielle did not take Yolanda out of school. I don't remember ever seeing Yolanda, even though she was a first grader. The school building was large, and any white children who attended were kept far from my classroom. They were assigned separate teachers and were hurried in and out of school through a back entrance. Yolanda Gabrielle came to school every day for 3 weeks. During that time, her family's home was attacked. Stones and rotten eggs were thrown, windows were broken, hecklers gathered in front of the house and threatened to hurt the Gabrielle children. Daisy's husband was about to lose his job. Though the police set up protection for the family and a wonderful New Orleans woman named Betty Wisdom offered to drive Yolanda to school each day, Daisy Gabrielle knew her daughter was still at risk. In the end, the Gabrielles gave up. They not only took Yolanda out of school, but also moved the family to another state, a northern state where Daisy's husband had grown up. It was time to get away from Louisiana. Here's another quote from Good Housekeeping at the bottom of that page. Then one afternoon, after the police had taken them through the mob, the child had looked behind her and suddenly became aware of the danger. That night she woke up screaming. When Daisy went to her, she was babbling about those ladies who yell so ugly. Then Yolanda said her stomach hurt, that she didn't want to go to school the next day. Daisy held her in her arms, promising she could stay home, her heart heavy with the burden she had put on her family. 3 little girls at McDonough. While I was attending William France, a couple of miles away, 3 girls were integrating McDonough number 19. Their names were Leona, Tessie, and Gail. Here's a quote from the New York Times. Some 30 minutes after the scheduled start of classes, the marshals pulled up at McDonough number 19 with 3 pupils accompanied by parents, a man, and 2 women. An angry roar went up from the whites among the mixed crowd of spectators. "Kill them, N-words," shouted one man. The police rapidly moved the crowd off the sidewalk to a parkway in the middle of the street. The parents and the pupils, who were in pigtails and freshly laundered dresses, were rushed into the stucco building by the deputy marshals. And then here's a quote from the U.S. News and World Report. Attendance dwindled until on November 17th, 3 Negro girls and 1 white child were the only pupils present at McDonough School number 19, which normally had 467 pupils. The other integrated Negro had the company of only 3 white children in William T. France School, which normally had 576 pupils. Riots in New Orleans. In those first tense days of integration, people didn't protest just in front of the schools. Trouble broke out across the city. As I sat quietly huddled with Mrs. Henry, mobs of protesters roamed the streets. People threw rocks and bricks at passing cars. Some even tossed flaming bottles of gasoline. Hospital emergency rooms began to fill up. White people drove through the city at night, leaving burning crosses as warnings in black neighborhoods. African Americans knew this, was meant to frighten them into giving up integration. The segregationist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan had been burning crosses in front of black homes for many years all over the South. White parents from New Orleans even traveled to Baton Rouge to protest school integration in front of the state legislature. They wanted J. Skelly Wright, the federal judge who ordered integration, to be removed from office. And here is a quote from the New Orleans Times. Parents and children from integrated New Orleans schools bore a miniature black coffin containing a blackened effigy of U.S. Judge J. Skelly Wright into the Louisiana Capitol. The House stood up and, with a long roll of applause, saluted the parents as the demonstrators moved on into the legislative chambers. One woman in the group shouted, "The judge is dead, we have slaughtered him." Some of the group feigned weeping and mourning, others laughed. The blackened doll inside the yard-long coffin wore a black suit. In its pocket was a small gavel. And that is where we're stopping today.